So today we'll discuss about the topic paleoecology, and we try to understand what is the role of paleoecology, or how much paleoecological informations are important to be a paleontologist. So first of all, we all know that ecology is basically the study of animals or plants or other organisms in relation to their environment. So obviously, with study of organisms with respect to its environment, the past environment in which the organism lives. So it is the study of the ecology of fossil specimens or fossil species, that is during which they live. Now the thing is, we always believe, or we generally understand, that ecology is always about the uh, environment in which an organism lives. But in proper sense, in the term ecology indicates that it is the interaction of organisms with its surroundings, and surroundings means all the living and non-living things. So an organisms surrounded by other organism, their interaction is also falls within the study of ecology, as well as the interaction of the organism with the environment, that is the non-living things, that is also comes under the study of ecology. So ecology is the interaction of an organisms or a group of organisms with its surroundings, and includes all the living and non-living things. So paleoecology is the interaction of ancient organisms with the environment and other organisms. Now the term ecology was first proposed by a German biologist, Ernest Haeckel, in 1966. The term came from two Greek words. The first one is oikos, that means house or shelter, and the second one is logos, that means logical study or science. So it is the science or logical study of the shelter or of the house in which an organism lives and thereby interact with its surroundings. Now the study of paleoecology have many limitations. We have certain restrictions during the study of paleoecology. A major limitation in paleoecological study will be the partial and incomplete record of fossil. Now, from our previous classes, we came to know that all the living organisms of any time, they are not going into the fossil record. Only a very tiny percentage, only a very small percentage of organisms are going into the record, and among them only a few are discovered, or only a few are available for any kind of scientific study. So because of the incompleteness of the fossil record, sometimes it becomes very difficult to someone to identify or to say anything properly about the ancient ecological conditions. Secondly, during the fossilization, or during this entire time span, that span what a rock will undergoes from its origin to the present day, many of the characteristics or many of the properties of the rock are changed, because we know that from the origin of the earth to the present day, many physico-chemical conditions of the earth are changed, such as earth becomes gradually cool down, Earth becomes oxygen rich. Initial Earth was reducing, that is, there was no free oxygen. Atmospheric composition was changed, surfacial processes were changed. In the initial conditions, there were frequent volcanism, frequent meteorite impact. The Earth's crust were highly mobile, and Earth was all very hot. Along with that, there are oxygen devoid of free oxygen. There's no ozone layer. So you can see the physico-chemical condition of the early Earth was completely different from the present Earth. So with changing physico-chemical condition of the Earth, the all the physical chemical processes occurring at or near the Earth's surface, they are also changing with time. So the rocks formed during a certain time, at that time the physico-chemical conditions is not same to the present day. So during this entire time span, the rocks will suffer certain changes with changing earth physico-chemical conditions, and that changes a lot of physics and chemistry of the then environment in which the original rock was formed. So maybe, or in most of the cases, uh, if we are not very much aware of this fact, then we may interpret a false note about the ancient environmental conditions. So we must be very aware, and we must be taken into consideration that there must or that the rock suffers a suitable amount of physico-chemical condition after its formation, and that is synchronous with the changing Earth's physico-chemical condition. So we must take special awareness uh, to conclude anything or to say anything about the ancient physico-chemical condition or about the ancient environment. Thirdly, shells or the organisms may have been transported and fossils may be mixed. So as we see that mostly after the death of an organisms, the dead bodies of organisms, they are gathered and uh, going into the fossil record when they are deposited below the base level of erosion, because above the base level of erosion the uh, zone or the area is very much prone to erosion and they can be reworked again and again. So mostly whenever they fall or they go below the base level of erosion, the chance of being fossilized, chance of being go into the fossil record will be more. So in many times, because of the surfacial processes, the land organisms or the terrestrial organisms, they are transported through those natural agents such as a river can carry the dead bodies of many organisms, and that is most commonly seen in our daily life in the present day also. In the flood time, we all noticed in the daily newspaper or in the news channels or even in front of our eye that uh, the flood water carries a lot of dead bodies of cows, donkeys, dogs, and even certain sometimes humans also. So by this way, the natural agents can carry the uh, organisms' dead bodies and they deposited in the basins, which is below the base level of erosion. So thereby, all the organisms, whether they are of land or whether they are of oceans, they are virtually mixed up with each other, and that creates some problem if you are not aware about this fact. So you may interpret, if you find a marine organism cell such as a whale along with a dead body of human, so you may interpret that both those organisms live in aquatic conditions, live in oceans. So that will be a false interpretation, that will be a completely wrong interpretation. So you must be very much aware about the taphonomy by which an organism can carried out after its death by the natural agents and deposited in the basin, deposited below the base level of erosion. Again, sometimes it happened that after the formation of a rock, when a rock is exposed at the surface, such that what we see in our surroundings, that many rocks of different ages are exposed, and many of those rocks contains a lots of fossils. So it may happen that those fossils are gradually eroded out by the natural agents, by weathering. They are loosened from the host rock, and with time they are carried by the natural agents and deposited in the basins. So what happens, an older age organisms or an older age fossils is mixed up with the um, present day organisms. Okay, so that means after the formation of fossil, that fossil can be again reworked by natural agents and deposited with the organisms shells or organism dead bodies of different types. So two different time planes organisms are mixed up by the natural agents. That is called time average assemblage, or the incident is called time averaging. So whenever we go to interpret uh, about anything about the ecological conditions, about the uh, depositional conditions of an fossil assemblage, we must take care about these facts. Lastly, the post-depositional diagenetic processes. We know that after the deposition of sediments, the loose sediments go some amount of pressure temperature increase so that they can be solidified and form sedimentary rocks. So these changes from loose sediment to the solid sedimentary rock, the changes suffered by the rock is called diagenesis. Now, during diagenesis, many of the fossil organisms which otherwise preserved, that means which cannot be decomposed or which cannot be destroyed by the decomposing bacteria or scavengers, but during diagenesis it may happen those dead bodies or those cells, they are destroyed. Or sometimes the opposite thing also happen, that is some uh, organic evidences, they are favored by the diagenetic processes during its preservation. That means the diagenetic processes favor the preservations of certain organic evidences, such as the traces of organisms. The trace fossils, they are favored for preservation by the diagenetic processes. So an original organisms, they are more prone to the destruction during diagenetic processes, whereas a trace fossil, they are or they can be favored during diagenetic processes. So depending upon the nature of the organism evidences, the behavior of diagenetic processes, that can also vary, and thereby the chance of preservation, chance of being going into the fossil record, or chance of being preserved as fossil, that can also vary. So these points indicate us, or these points says us, that whenever you study a whenever being a paleontologist you start study some fossil records, you must take very much care. Otherwise, all you interpret, all you say about the assemblage will be wrong. Now, an organisms which live in an environment, so that organism must be well adapted, that organism must be well fit to that environment, so that uh, he or she can live happily and sustain that physicochemical conditions. So organisms must be well adapted to survive in an environment, and fossils provide some clues to the organism's lifestyle in which the organism lives. So um, if you move over the earth's surface, your footprints will be there over the earth's surface. So if those footprints uh, preserved in the rock record, they will definitely say that the organism present during this time is just walking over this surface. That means he is quite relaxed, because your walking footprint and your running footprint will be different. There will be difference in space, there will be difference in depression uh, of your foot. So during running, the sediments will be more submerged due to your foot pressure, and the distance of between two foot steps will also enlarge. So whenever you are running, that means you are feeling some amount of threat naturally. uh, so whenever some future organism, if they get the footprints of a human being uh, as walking or as running, definitely they indicate about the lifestyle of those uh, human beings in future record. Third, analogy to living relatives, that means their relations to living relatives, how they interact with other living organisms. Fourth one is functional morphology, that means uh, which which organ of any particular organisms are used for what purpose. That is the functional aspect of any organism, such that the wings of bird, they are used for mainly flight. Okay, so like this, the body hair of any organism, the body hair of the cold areas organisms, they are particularly formed. You may see the large amount of or long body hair in the cold areas organisms. If you see a polar bear, they contains much more long body hair than the uh, temperate regions bear. So that is because due to the um, prevention or maintaining the body temperature, those body hair are used of. So these kinds of morphological aspects um, and their functions, they can be identified in the fossil records also. Association with other organisms, similar preferences. So whenever an organism lives in an community or lives in assemblages, uh, similar types organisms, they prefer similar type of habitat, they prefer similar type of environmental conditions in which they live. And lastly, the type of substrate. Some organisms dig within the substrate, so those organisms which basically dug within the substrate, they prefer substrate, whereas some organisms, they prefer try to capture a pre-existing uh, digging ground. That means already there was a hollow in the substrate, and that hollow is well enough to maintain the space. That means that hollow is not very loose so that it collapse. So in different environments, organisms or in different types of organisms prefer different types of substrate. That means the bottom surface over which they create their houses. If someone says you that you please go and make a house over a river floodplain which is full of mud. Okay. Whereas someone say you please go and make a house or make your home in a relatively stable, strong surface substrate. So it is in our daily practice also, we all see that whenever we construct any building, we are preferred a solid surface or solid substrate. And that is, whenever some amount of pressure is added to it, the undersurface will not becomes volatile, or undersurface will not go to liquefaction state, so that that can be moved, that can disturb our construction. So any construction will be preferred over a solid substrate, so that the substrate or the undersurface rocks that can hold the construction for a prolonged time. If the undersurface underground rocks are very fragile, very mobile, then we are not prefer to construct any type of buildings, any kind of construction over that surface. So that is why substrate is a very good uh, indicator, or substrate is a very good information what we get from the fossil records, because apart from the other things, these are mostly all the physico-chemical conditions about the environment. For that we have to depend the indirect evidences present in the rock, because that that time, the ancient time environmental conditions, the ancient time pressure, temperature, um, physico-chemical conditions, that can be directly observed in your in your eyes. So for that, you have to depend on some indirect evidences which are found or which are preserved along with the fossils. But the substrate on which, over which an organism lives, that is the only evidence that is directly preserved along with the organisms. So basically, that is the host sedimentary rock over which an organism lives, and along with the sedimentary rock, the organisms goes also into the fossil record. So whenever you found a fossil in the rock record, you are also getting information about the substrate condition over which the organism lives directly. So it is the most directly observed record for an organisms, for an organisms uh, in ecological condition or ecological information which is found in the fossil record. Now, the environment in which an organism lives is called its habitat. Uh, this habitat might be a rocky seashore, that means of hard substrate. The habitat may be a grassland. That habitat may be a soft sandy surface. So if you look at the coastal conditions of India, you may see a huge difference between the east coast of India and west coast of India. The east coast of India is sandy, whereas the west coast of India is rocky. That means hard rock surfaces are there along the western coast. So definitely, as the substrate condition, as the coastal uh, areas of these two uh, coasts of India are different, so that definitely implies some effect about the organisms type as well as organisms behavior in the two coastal areas of India. So along with the habitat, along with the uh, different substrate, the organisms also change, because all organisms are not flexible in all kinds of environment. So organisms nature are changed, organisms composition are changed along with its habitat, as well as their behavior sometimes also changed. And it may happen that there may be more than one um, ecosystem in an area, so that called micro ecosystem. So in an area there may be more than one ecosystem. So, suppose in your area you are living on land and there is a pond, there is a river. So a pond ecosystem is there, a land ecosystem is there, a river ecosystem is there, a jungle ecosystem is there. So that means a given area consists lots of micro ecosystem. The ecological niche is defined as the organism's position in the habitat, that includes its way of life and the role it plays in the ecosystem. So in this entire ecosystems, the organism's place, the organism's role in that ecosystem is known as its ecological niche. Now, whenever we try to study ecology, we can study ecology with respect to some fossil species, obviously, but we can study this fossil species. Ecological study can be done in two ways. In the first type, the ecological study can be done with respect to a particular organisms, single organisms, or with respect to a single species, a single biological group living in that area. Their ecological study can be done, and that study is known as paleoecology. So paleoecology means it is the branch of paleoecology that concerned with studying life habits of organisms, its role, and the relationship of that organisms with other individuals as well as the environment for a particular species, for a particular biological group. Suppose we are trying to study the ecological conditions of tiger. So we are only focusing tiger along the entire forest environment. We are not considering any other animals within that forest. So here we are only focusing on a single species, on a single biological entity. That is fall under paleoecology. And whenever we are studying paleoecology or we are studying ecology of the entire community of an organism, not only a single species, not only a single biological group, but instead of that, we are concerned about the entire community, entire living things of that area. Suppose we are studying a forest environment. So here in paleoecology, we are considering tiger, elephants, the insects, all living things, along with the plants also, all living things within that forest environment. So the living things of that entire area, they are studied as a whole for this type of ecological study. So in paleoecology, the ecological study was done of the entire community. So in paleoecology, the study was done for fossil communities. In paleoecology, the study was done for fossil single species or single biological group. Now, whenever uh, someone wants to study an ecosystem or ecology of an area or a biological group, it can be a paleoecology, it can be paleosyncology. We must take care about the relationship of the organisms to their environment. And the environment means, as I already told you, ecology is not the interaction of organisms along with the uh, living things, or simply it's not the interaction of organisms with the non-living things, but instead in ecology we consider both living and non-living things. So whenever we try to study ecology or paleoecology, we must take care or we must deal with the relationship of organisms to their environment and their responses due to those environmental factors. So an organism's interaction in both ways, the how an organism behaves with the environment and how some environmental changes effects on the organisms, all those things are studied in paleoecology or ecology also. Now the environment is consist of two things. One is the abiotic thing or non-living things, that is the abiotic factors, and other is the living part, that is the biotic factors. Now, along abiotic factors, six main variables are there which can affect an organism's position and organism's behavior in an environment. The first one is light, temperature, oxygen, salinity, water depth, and substrate. So we will come one by one. So the first abiotic factor which we will discuss, that is uh, temperature. Now, temperature is one of the most important limiting factors affecting the horizontal as well as vertical distribution of recent day organisms. Now, why we are uh, studying ecology whenever we go to study paleoecology? Because for paleontology, we have to believe or we have to follow the law of uniformitarianism. So basically, for studying paleontology, what we did, as we are not able to see those organisms, those environments directly in front of our eyes, so what we believe that present is the key to the past. So before going to study paleoecology, we must know what ecology means and what are the ecological factors in the present day that can shape the present day environment, present day biological uh, behavior of an organism, present day biological composition in any place. So the present day factors that can be well understood by a ecologist, and after that they can be implied, or that knowledge can be implied to ancient times. So in the present time, we see that temperature plays a vital role for shaping the organism's composition, organism's behavior throughout the uh, earth. Now, in the present day, we see that the tropical areas or the equatorial areas, that is areas, they house the maximum diversity. And when you move from equator to poleward, we can see that the diversity, that means the variations of organisms, they falls rapidly towards poles. Even in the tropical areas, temperature below a certain depth within the ocean uh, water bodies is being sufficiently cold. You can see this vertical uh, depth relationship of temperature in an ocean body. So it is the only the surface part of the ocean which is warm, but after say 500 or 1000 meters, you can see the temperatures of ocean drops far below and becomes extremely cold, about 2 to 4 degrees centigrade in most of the part of the ocean if you see the vertical column. So only the superficial column, superficial portion of the ocean water, that is favorable for organisms to sustain. So you can see that there are microclimatic variation, that means temperature variations within a single habitat condition, within a single habitable uh, ocean body. And according to these, the organisms, they are also varies in the vertical column of oceans also. You can see whenever you visit any coastal area that there was a zone which is affected by the tidal activity. We know that in every day there are two times of tidal activity are there. There are two times of high tides are observed, and rest of the time it is the low tides. So the zone between the high tides and the low tide, it is known as intertidal zone. Now the intertidal zone, that particular zone is a harsh environment, because during high tide it is covered with ocean water, so temperature goes below, salinity grows different, and during low time it is open to the sunlight. Salinity also changed, the turbidity of water, the sedimentary uh, condition of the water of that particularly of that area, intertidal area, that is also changed. So that becomes a harsh condition for an organisms to live in those areas. So organisms living on those areas, they must be very much well adapted to this changing environmental conditions of that intertidal zone, which is suffered twice during a day. Now if we simply look at the temperature variations over the entire earth, we can see that over the entire earth temperature can vary across latitude. We know that the maximum amount of sunlight is earth gets along its equatorial region, and as we move from equator to towards pole, the amount of sunlight fallen over the earth's surface gradually decreasing. And we know that the earth's superficial temperature, a major source of our superficial temperature is the sunlight. So as sunlight um, decreased along latitude or across latitude, the temperature will also gradually becomes low towards the pole. Second, increase in depth, as we see that as depth increase, the effect of temperature will also uh, change. That means only it is only the upper 200 meter of the ocean body up to which sunlight can penetrate in the ocean water. So only the upper 200 meter will get sufficient amount of light, and thereby it is heated up by the sunlight. Rest of the water sunlight cannot penetrate, so that water becomes very much cold. And third, it is the relationship of ocean circulations. As you can see from this picture, that the equatorial region surface water was highly heated up, and the polar region surface water is being cold. So there is a broad ocean water circulation from equator towards pole. So the hot uh, equator surface water moves as surface water towards poles, and the polar heavy dense cold water, they moves towards the equator as bottom current. So along the ocean vertical column, if this one is suppose your vertical column, so the hot surface water moves towards the polar region at surface water, and the polar dense cold water, they sinks below and moves towards the equator as uh, the bottom current, as the bottom water. So there is a uh, convex, there is a circular cell of oceanic water circulation from equator to pole, and thereby the heat gained along the equatorial region, they are distributed throughout the earth surface, throughout all the ocean bodies. That is why um, the equatorial region neither becomes too hot to sustain, and at the same time the polar region not becomes too cold to sustain. That is because of this ocean circulation. If there was no ocean circulation, then both these areas, the equatorial region becomes extremely hot to sustain any living being, and the polar region becomes extremely cold for sustaining any living being. So that is the ocean circulation that maintain uh, a flexible temperature or suitable temperature for organisms to survive, to sustain in those conditions. At the same time, with changing temperature conditions, certain other chemical properties also found to vary in the water bodies, such as the solubility of carbon dioxide and oxygen. With temperature increase, we can see that the solubility of carbon dioxide and oxygen is decreased. So all the dissolved carbon dioxide, uh, all the dissolved oxygen in the water column, they becomes out from the water body. So if there was no oxygen in dissolved condition within the water body, so the organisms living in the uh, ocean water, they will not get oxygens. So that becomes an inhabitable place for organisms. Similarly, the carbon dioxide dissolved within the ocean body, they gradually released from the water body and added with the atmosphere carbon dioxide. So the Earth's greenhouse effect will be more intensified. So that creates problem. Second, with temperature, the solubility of salt increase. So the dissolved salt what we uh, get in the ocean water, their solubility with temperature, more and more salt can be soluble. So you can see that not only the physical conditions, but the chemical conditions will also change along with the changing temperature conditions. Here we give you example about the increasing temperature condition, but the opposite thing will happen uh, for decreasing temperature conditions. So every time, whenever temperature either goes up or either goes down, that is either temperature increase or decrease, all the physical chemical conditions of the environment change, and thereby the organisms may suffer to that changing physico-chemical conditions. If the change is very rapid, then most commonly the organisms are not able to cope up with that changing environmental conditions. But as this changing environmental conditions is slow, so organisms try to manage themselves, right? Organisms try to cope up with that changing environment. Now it is found that most organisms have a narrow range of uh, temperature tolerance. Okay, so mostly organisms are not, as I already told you, organisms are not uh, able to cope up with that if the temperature condition was very uh, high, or temperature rise or fall is very uh, certain, is very higher in amount, because organisms can survive only in a very low temperature and other physico-chemical conditions. The second factor for which organisms distribution in the environment is very much important, that is the oxygen level. Now oxygen level falls rapidly below photic zone. That means that zone up to which light can penetrate within the ocean water body, because up to that zone in which ocean water light can penetrate, that is the zone in which producers can survive. That means the plant bodies, marine plant, aquatic plants can survive, because for a plant to survive, they must do photosynthesis, and we all know that for photosynthesis, a major material required for photosynthesis to be happen is the sunlight. So below photic zone, as there was no sunlight available, so obviously there will be no plants there. So along with the photosynthesis, plants also produce a byproduct, that is oxygen, which is removed from their body and they mixed with the environment. So if there was no uh, if there was no sunlight below 200 meter, there will no plant bodies. So the oxygen producing machine, that is the oxygen producing plants, their uh, they are not available below 200 meter. So it is only the above 200 meter, that is within the photic zone, oxygen producing plants are there because of the availability of sunlight, and they produce a byproduct, that is oxygen, during their photosynthesis process, which they remove from their body, and that oxygen mixed with the ocean water, which can be taken by the ocean other organisms or the other animal bodies during their respiration process. So all things are linked up. Available of sunlight is linked with the photosynthesis process by the plants. If photosynthesis is done, oxygen is removed as a byproduct. If oxygen is removed, then there will be animals which can take those dissolved oxygen within the ocean body during their respiration process by the animal bodies. So if one thing is discarded, then the entire this chain will be collapsed. So that is why it is the only the upper part of the ocean body, it is only the photic zone where, because of the presence of autotrophs, because of the presence of plant bodies, other organisms as also live in that places. Now, oceans, they have been typically stratified with respect to our oxygen also. So it is not the temperature as you see in the previous slide. Uh, Along with the temperature, as you can see, the presence of autotrophs will also vary. So that is affected by the presence of oxygen in the entire ocean column also. Now, depending on the oxygen content, a aquatic body, a water body can be divided into several different environments. When the oxygen concentration is about 8 to 2 milliliter per liter, the environment is called oxic environment. That means it have sufficient amount of oxygen there. And you can see decreasing oxygen content from 2 to 0.2 milliliter per liter, the environment is called dysoxic. With zero point 0.2 to almost 0 milliliter, it is called suboxic. And when there was no free oxygen, it is called anoxic. Mind it, all this environment or all this oxygen content is about the free oxygen, that is not the oxygen which is already there in a chemical composition, but it is the free oxygen in the form of O2 that may be present in atmosphere also, that may be present in ocean water body also. Now, oxygen constantly renewed in the deep sea by worldwide bottom water circulation. So we can see that along with the photic zone, oxygen concentration is also decreasing. So it is obviously came to our mind then during the large depth ocean bodies in their um, greater depths, that environment may be completely anoxic. That means there will be no free oxygen. Uh, you can see that along with the uh, hot and cold water movement, as I already told you, that the equatorial region gets immense amount of sunlight and the heated high this high hot water moves towards the polar region as surface warm water, and the polar region cold water they goes below and moves as bottom current towards the equator region. So there is a broad oceanic circulation belt found in the earth. Here the red bands is the hot surface ocean current, and the blue band is the cold oxygen is bottom ocean current. Now you can see due to this circulation of oceanic water throughout the entire earth, the hot oxygen rich equatorial water that goes to the polar region. Now in polar region the surface water is cold oxygen rich, as we know that the water with higher temperature that is lighter, whereas water which is cold that will be heavier. So in the polar region, the cold surface water that is replaced by the equatorial hot water. So the cold surface water goes below vertically, and now they are moving as bottom water towards the equatorial region. So the bottom portion of the ocean body, they will get some amount of free oxygen because of the circulation of this cold polar water. So that is why if you see the vertically the oxygen concentration within the ocean water body, you can see that the surfacial conditions, that is up to the photic zone, up the surfacial 200 meter of the ocean body, there sufficient amount of oxygen is there because of the presence of the autotrophs. Below this photic zone, oxygen content is rapidly decreasing, and again after some depth, about 1000 meter depth or about 500 meter depth, the oxygen concentration again starts to increase to a certain level, not as much as the surface water, but oxygen level is slightly higher throughout the ocean column. And this increase in oxygen concentration in the bottom of the ocean body, that is due to the cold bottom ocean current. So that will bring the cold oxygen rich polar water moving as bottom current towards the equator region, and due to that the lower portions of the ocean uh, water, they will get some amount of oxygen. So if you now see the entire ocean column, you can find that is there is only a narrow zone, that is particularly from 250 to about 500 meter. There is a narrow zone where there was almost, the ocean column is almost devoid of any free oxygen. So that particular zone is known as oxygen minimum zone. Okay. So oxygen minimum zone is not occur at the extreme bottom of the ocean column, but it is about occurring from below the photic zone to about 500 to 1000 meters. And that this depth is vary depending on the local variables, local circumstances. So grossly or approximately it is the depth below the photic zone, that is below 200 meter up to 1000 meter, where oxygen saturation is at its lowest. That means there is almost no free oxygen within the water body. That is known as oxygen minimum zone. Now the oxygen concentration is also affected by salinity also. Said, and the presence or absence of oxygen that can also affect the preservation of organisms. So the sediments, as we already came to know from our earlier classes, that for an organism being preserved, somehow we have to discard oxygen from its surroundings, because after the death of an organism, all the decomposing agents, all the scavengers, their activity will be enhanced in presence of free oxygen. So if somehow we can discard the free oxygen from the environment, um, the dead body of the organisms, they becomes more prone to go into the fossil record. So the sediments in which there was little or no oxygen are uh, favored for the preservations of different sedimentary structures, or as well as they are those conditions are favored for the preservations of fossils also. So if an organisms uh, after its death deposited in this oxygen minimum zone, their chance of fossilization is far greater compared to the organisms after its death deposited in photic zone or goes further below in these bottom portions of the ocean current. So it is the oxygen minimum zone. Because of the devoid of oxygen, although organisms uh, although living organism for living an organism in this environment, it becomes very much harsh, But at the same time, this portion, because of the oxygen deficiency, they are favoring the fossilization process. Next important variable or abiotic factor is salinity. Now, salinity is a measure of the dissolved salt content of natural waters. It is usually measured in parts per thousand, and normal marine water shows 35 parts per thousand values, whereas the normal freshwater value, freshwater, they show the value ranges from 0 to 0.5. So you can see the salinity difference of the fresh water, what we drink in our daily purpose or what we use in our daily purpose, and the normal marine saline water. There is a huge difference in dissolved salt content within the water. Now, the greatest variability of salinity is found in the coastal areas where, with regular tides, tidal water comes, regular waves came, and all the rivers, they meet with the ocean bodies. So in those areas are the greatest variability are found. Now, a species with a narrow tolerance range of salinity is called stenohaline. So as I already told you that most of the living beings, most of the species, they have a very narrow range of tolerance of the different physicochemical conditions. So in case of salinity, when a species have very narrow range of tolerance of salinity, they are called stenohaline species. Whereas if a species can tolerate a huge range of variations of salinity, that means they can be uh, sustained in both saline as well as freshwater by coping up with that changing environment, and they are called euryhaline. So euryhaline means broad salinity conditions sustaining species, whereas stenohaline means narrow range of variation salinity condition sustaining species. So if we take an example, one famous example is our hillside fish. This hillside fish basically is a marine fish, but during monsoon, this hillside fish moves towards the river, towards the land areas along the river. And we will know that there is a difference between the salinity condition of marine and river water. But hillside fish can sustain those two different uh, salinity conditions. Now, the areas where there was high amount of sunlight, such as the equatorial areas which have high amount of sunlight, thereby they are most heated portions of the earth. So mostly, in because of this high amount of heat, maximum amount of evaporation is also occurring in those areas. And as maximum amount of evaporation occur, the water having some amount of dissolved salts, they become concentrated with continuous evaporation, and ultimately precipitation of salts happen after certain time. So increased amount of heat is enhancing increased amount of evaporation and thereby enhancing increased amount of precipitation. So more heat, more evaporation, more precipitation. Now, why organisms have narrow tolerances of salinity? It is because of the osmotic pressure. If the body fluids of organisms are not in equilibrium with the surrounding medium, because we know that whenever the salinity conditions of an aquatic body of an water changes, that means the dissolved salt content of the water also changes. So that will affect the density as well as the viscosity of the aqueous medium of the water body. So with this changing uh, chemical conditions, because of the salinity change, and organisms, their body or their body fluid pressure, that is the osmotic pressure of the body fluid of an organisms, they sometimes are not able to cope up with that changing salinity conditions. So sometimes with changing salinity conditions, as the osmotic pressure of the body fluid of an organisms uh, disturbed, so either organisms get ample amount of salinity that the organisms cannot sustain, or the body fluid of an organisms is immensely removed out from their body, so the organisms become dehydrated and ultimately they suffer death. So this you may also see in our daily life also. In summer conditions, we have a huge amount of sweat. Now, why we say by our elder parents that uh, in summer time you have to take a lot of amount of water, or sometimes we take the glucose water. Basically, during summer, because of the intense heat, um, a lot of sweat is coming out from our body, and that sweat water takes lots of salts from our body. So again, the osmotic pressure of our body disturbs. So we feel very much lethargic. We did not get some very energy. We did not get energy for to do any kinds of works. uh, we becomes lazy, actually we becomes very tired. So that is due to this osmotic pressure imbalance between between the body fluids and the atmosphere, or the surrounding temperature. So for that, we have to take a lot amount of water, a lot amount of salt supply to our body. So most organisms, they cannot survive this uh, changing salinity conditions, but there are few exceptions, such as the oysters, mussels, snails, some crustaceans. They can survive. Even some fishes also. So the famous example is hilsa fish. They can sustain with the changing salinity conditions. The fourth important variable, uh, abiotic variable, is the water depth. Now, as we previously uh, came to know that along with the water depth, mainly two things are varied. The first one is intensity of light, and the second one is the overburden hydrostatic pressure. That means the pressure of the overlying water body. Now, the light, as we already came to know, that the light can go or penetrate into the ocean body up to 200 meter. So that zone is known as photic zone. But instead of 200 meter, if you consider more closely, we can see that it is the only the above 100 meter up to which light can penetrate well, and plants in these upper 100 meter can take that amount of light and use them in their photosynthesis process. Below 100 meter, although light can penetrate, but from 100 meter to 200 meter, within that zone, that amount of light is not sufficient so that plants can do photosynthesis. So again, you can see that within this photic zone, within this 200 meter, that is also not sufficient. In this zone, light is also not sufficient for plants to do photosynthesis. So it is the only top 100 meter which gets sufficient amount of sunlight for the plants to do photosynthesis. So a very narrow zone within the entire ocean water column. Surface ecosystems based on primary producer, and as within this 100 meter, that is, there are primary producers, there are autotrophs, there are plants. So depending on those plants, depending on those autotrophs, all the heterotrophs, that means all the animal bodies who depend on those plant bodies, their concentration also found maximum within this top 100-meter surface water. Now, bottom ecosystems based on material drifting down. So the bottom part of the ocean, they are based on mainly few things. That means that the ocean water circulation from the uh, cold polar water and the drifted material from the land to the bottom part. And because of this hard situation, because of these rare conditions of drifting, only a very and low oxygen, no sunlight, a completely dark area, only a very few organisms who can sustain in this dark condition, they are found to occur in those higher depth areas of the oceans. As well as those areas also suffer higher hydrostatic pressure, because above their head there is a huge thick amount of water, and that water creates a lot of pressure. If you compare to the surface area, surface portion of the oceans, that portion is almost the superficial condition, so the hydrostatic pressure is far less. Whereas an organism lives in 2000-meter depth, so that organism suffers a huge hydrostatic pressure, and that huge hydrostatic pressure can be adjusted by their body condition, because otherwise the entire body of an organism becomes completely squeezed. Next important factor varies along with the water depth is the carbon compensation depth or carbonate compensation depth. It is the depth about 3000 to 4000 meter below which no carbonate is there. That means all the carbonates are completely dissolved at this depth. So the organisms having all the carbonate hard parts, they can only sustain, they can only live up to this level. Beyond this level, the carbonate hard part bearing organisms, they cannot sustain. Because of the hydrostatic pressure and other physical chemical changes, all the carbonates becomes completely dissolved at this depth. Similarly, there was a silica compensation depth, that means organisms having hard parts of silica SiO2, and that depth is about 6000 meter. So below that depth or greater than 6000 meter depth, all the organisms having silica composition in their hard part, they cannot survive. All silica becomes completely dissolved about 6000 meter depth. So that is called SCD or silica compensation depth. The next important character or next important property, that is called light. So light promotes photosynthesis and is therefore very important in controlling the plant distribution, because as we already came to know that uh, for doing photosynthesis by the autotrophs, sunlight is an essential component. So in marine environment, the food chains are mainly supported by the plants, and for them light is an important component. So mostly light um, determined or light gives the marine condition an important um, source of energy by which the autotrophs uh, produce food, autotrophs photosynthesize, and thereby producing a byproduct oxygen and producing lots of foods for themselves and for other organisms. So the entire ecosystem is basically depending on the amount of sunlight. Most of the sunlight for doing photosynthesis are restricted within top 100 meter. So along with the autotrophs, all other organisms are mostly restricted within that particular zone. Now, the intensity of sunlight, they are depend, or the depth uh, of light that can be penetrated underwater, that depend on four factors. Firstly, the intensity of light following uh, on the water, that means the amount of sunlight falling over the water. As we know that equatorial region have more amount of sunlight, um, it will get, whereas the polar region it will get lesser amount of sunlight. So that amount of sunlight, that intensity of sunlight is an important factor up to which light can penetrate. So although the 100-meter depth, as we already told, that is the maximum zone of sunlight in which photosynthesis can be done, but that depth can also vary from equator to pole. Second, time of the day. uh, the intensity of light varies during the day. During the 12 o'clock, uh, an area suffers or an area gets maximum amount of sunlight. We know that during this entire 24 hours day span, the amount of sunlight also varies starting from the morning to the evening time. Across latitude, intensity also varies. Clarity of water, that means the amount of dissolved salt or the amount of dissolved sediment, that will also affect it for passing light underwater. So more and more amount of dissolved material, more and more amount of turbid water, more and more amount of sediment mixed within the water, sunlight cannot penetrate far below. So for moving sunlight below the water surface or moving sunlight underwater, uh, it will be it will require much clear water. More intense amount of sunlight are found at equator, and thereby angle of incidence decreases towards pole, so the polar region gets less amount of sunlight. So the most densest vegetation, the rainforest dense, the most of the forest inland, as well as most of the forest in or most of the plants in the ocean body, they are found along the equatorial to tropical regions. The fourth important fact, or the sixth important factor by which the distribution of organisms or the ecology of organisms depends, that is the substrate. Now, substrate is very important mainly for the bottom dwelling aquatic organisms, that is those organisms who live their life over that substrate. If a substrate is too soft or too hard, the organisms may not be able to dig or to move from one place to other over that substrate. Soft substrate are the preservation medium for most of the organisms, and in soft substrate, and organisms can easily dig and goes underground, whereas in hard substrate, a pre-existing cavity, a pre-existing hole can be retained. So that will be more uh, steady thing, but organisms cannot modify those hard substrate. And even sometimes if an organism hit by the wave currents to that rocky substrate, organisms may suffer some kinds of injuries also. So the character and distribution of substrates are one of the important factor for an organisms to live in that place, to choose that substrate as their habitable place. Now, we may consider mainly three types of substrate found in the nature. That is, first one is the rocky bottom substrate, that is the hard substrates. Here mainly the organisms which are attached, which are sessile, which remains fixed in their position, they are found in those areas. That is the immobile organisms, they are found mainly in those areas. Second one is the muddy substrate. That means here the organisms are although not attached through any organ to that substrate, but because of the cohesiveness of the mud, the mobileness of the organisms becomes very restricted. So almost the organisms become stuck to that particular substrate. So organisms depend to the deposit feeders organisms only depend for food to the deposited material over that substrate. They cannot move virtually from one place to another. And sometimes in these substrate, organisms may dig and go underground also. And the last one, that is known as the sandy substrate, where organisms can move from one place to another easily. So there we found maximum mobile organisms, and they are mostly filter feeders, because they are sandy substrate, so they are very loose, and often it is floating within the water. So organisms takes the uh, floating nutritious particle bearing water within their digestive tract. From them they particularly choose the food element and excrete all the unnecessary things, all the sediments, all the excess amount of water, those things. So that is why they are called filter feeders. They particularly from this nutrient rich water, they filter the food particles. Sometimes there we found some grazers also. Grazers are those organisms which take the algae is coated over other surface as their food particles. So an algae coating a substrate, the grazer organisms basically take those algae from those substrate. So different kinds of mobile animals, that means those animals which can move over the substrate, they are particularly found over the sandy substrate. And as I already told you, that it is the substrate that is the only information about the ecological conditions, all other ecological conditions of the environment of an organism. It is the substrate which can be directly observed along with the fossils. Now, whenever someone want to study the ecological conditions, mostly being a paleontologist, we will go for the marine record because of the various reasons. In our earlier studies, we came to know that the marine environment has the mostly occur below the base level of erosion. So organisms fall in the ocean bottom, that is below the base level of erosion. They are favored by the um, fossilization processes, as they can the percentage of oxygen or the decomposing bacterial activity will be far less, and they cannot be reworked again as they are falling below the base level of erosion. So, and mostly uh, as we take the present day example as our learning tool and imply them in the fossil record. So because of that, we have to know the present day marine environments well, so that we can interpret or we can work in the ancient environments also. Now, if we look at the marine topography, modern day ocean topography, you may find different zones at different depths. The most coastal part, that is the beach part, and the intertidal zones, that is known as littoral zone. Here you can see this is the land part, this portion is the land part, and this is the junction on point of land and sea. These areas consist of this high tide zone, high tide level, mean sea level, and the low tide level. So this portion, that is between the high tide and the low tide, this portion, the B zone, that is the intertidal zone. That means whenever high tide comes, the water level is reached there, and during low tide, the water level reach there. So that is the zone in which the tidal activity is observed. That is why it is known as intertidal zone. Now, below this littoral zone, there is neritic zone, which is shallow depth ocean water with low inclination, and this is completely covered all times with the oceanic water. But the inclination of this surface is very low. This is also known as continental shelf area, and the zone is known as neritic zone. It reaches up to the 200-meter, that is up to the photic zone. Below 200-meter to about 4000 meter, Here you can see the inclination of the surface increases with respect to continental shelf. This is known as this portion with increased slope is known as continental slope, and the zone is known as bathyal zone. It reaches from 200 to the 4000 meter. Below 4000 meter, again the substrate becomes more uh, horizontal or more less in amount of inclination, that is known as abyssal plane, and the zone is known as abyssal zone. And below that abyssal zone, all the trenches and deeper part of the oceans occur, and that can go up to 10,000 or 11,000 meter also. And this is known as hadal zone. So these are the four zones, or rather five zones, found in an ocean column. Littoral zone, that is the continental uh, ocean body junction part. uh, Littoral zone, the continental shelf, that is neritic zone. Continental slope, that is bathyal zone. Abyssal plain, that is abyssal zone. And the trench part, deeper oceanic trench part, that is known as hadal zone. Now marine animals, according to their relationship to their environment, as we can see from the oceanic depth zone pattern, that mostly oceans are uh, particularly live within the neritic zone, that is the up to the depth of 200 meter, that is the photic zone. So obviously most autotrophs are living there, and with respect to those autotrophs, the other animals depending on those plants, they also live within this photic zone. Now marine animals, uh, the living in the ocean body, uh, they can be classified into two groups, whether they're living at or inside the surface, or they are living outside the surface. That means whether they live, if it is my substrate line, that means below this portion there are sediment or rock, and above this portion that is water, so it is sediment, and above portion is water. So this is the line of junction between the sediment water. Now, some organisms live at the top of the surface, at the top of the sediment body, or inside the sediment body, such that this organism lives inside the sediment body, whereas these organisms, they are always in contact with the surface but does not go underground. They are living at the top of the surface. So these organisms, and some organisms are there, particularly those are the fishes, they are freely moving, they are completely detached from the surface. They float or they swim in the ocean water body. So depending upon an organism's lives inside the substrate or outside the surface substrate, organisms can be classified into two groups. One group is infauna, that means the fauna, the organisms, lives inside the substrate, and the other group is epifauna, that means the fauna or the organisms lives outside the substrate. So this top surface bearing organisms, these fish, these plants, they are the epiphonas because they lives outside the substrate, whereas these organisms which lives inside the substrate, they are infauna because they live inside the sediment, inside the substrate. So two types, infauna and epifauna. In means which lives inside, epi means which lives outside the substrate. Now marine organisms can be again classified according to where they live and how they move. The previous classification is either they are inside the substrate or outside the surface. Now among these infauna and epifauna, they are again classified according to where they live and how they move. The first group is known as plankton, that means organisms that live suspended in the water column and they are drifted with currents, that means the floaters. They have no moving apparatus. They are almost static. They can only float over the water surface, and they move from one place to another place along with the ocean currents. So they are almost static. Only they can move with the ocean currents. That means the floaters. They are known as plankton. Okay, and their living condition is known as planktonic. Among the planktonic, there are three groups. One is phytoplankton, that means those planktons of plants, those planktons who can do photosynthesis. There are zooplanktons, that is planktons of animals, that means they cannot produce their own food, feed on phytoplanktons. And the other type is pseudoplankton. This is, as we know, pseudo means false. So pseudoplankton means in organisms whose original mode of life may be other kind apart from the planktonic, that means they are not floaters, but during their entire lifespan they live some amount of time as planktonic, as floater. So suppose an organism during its juvenile stage, during its early ontogeny, they are living as floater, and in rest of the time of their time span they are um, dealing with, they are living some other kinds of habitable conditions. So those organisms are known as pseudoplanktons. The second group is benthos, or you may call it benthic, or you may call it benthonic. So benthos, benthic, benthonic are all same. Benthos means bottom dwellers or substrate dwellers. That means organisms living on or in the ocean bottom. So all the organisms living uh, inside and at the top of the substrate, they are all known as benthic. So benthic organisms or benthos organisms can be both epifauna or infauna. Infauna benthic is those lives inside the substrate. Epifauna benthic is those epipaunas that is lives at the top of the surface but always in contact with the substrate. Now, benthic organisms can be of two types. One is sessile, other is vagile. Sessile means those organisms which are fixed to the substrate. That means they are not able to move from one place to another. They attach themselves to the substrate. They are called sessile. Whereas vagile organisms are those that lives above the substrate and they can move over that substrate. So they are mobile faunas. Those are known as vagile benthic. Apart from these two groups, one is the floater or free floating group, that is plankton. One is the bottom dwelling group, substrate dwelling group, that is benthos. There is a third group called nekton. These are the organisms which can freely swim within the water body. So all the fishes, other reptiles which can swim freely within the water body, they are called nekton or nektonic. So these are the three groups found in the ocean water column. Planktonic, that is floaters; benthonic, that is bottom dwellers or substrate dwellers; and nektonic, that is swimmers. The planktonic, as I told you, the floating organisms, these lack locomotory organs. They have so little developed that they are essentially ineffective. Their distribution is controlled, or they move primarily by waves and currents in the sea. They may, upon death, sink to the ocean floor in any depth of ocean water. So the planktonic bodies, they can be distributed all the surface ocean waters as they are floaters. And after that, they are settled in the entire ocean. So they can, all the planktonic bodies, dead bodies can be found in shallow depth also, as well as in deeper depth also. Because after that depth, they will settle to the ocean bottom. They can be deposited in continental shelf, they can be deposited in continental slope, or they can be deposited in Hadal zone also. So dead bodies of planktons as fossils, they can be found in various depths. Nectons, these are organisms that have the power of swimming through the water with comparative case. Their remains may be found in neritic, in bathyal, and rarely in abyssal sediments. So almost the nectons also they can be found in different depth zones of the marine condition. Now the condition pelagic. Pelagic is commonly applied to drifting, floating, and swimming. So all the organisms except the bottom dwelling. So except the benthic part, benthic organisms, all the organisms living within the water column that includes the nectonic as well as the floaters. They together known as pelagic. So pelagic is basically, if you simply try to know them, pelagic is basically planktonic, plank, plankton plus necton group. So together this plankton, that means floater and swimmer group, they together known as pelagic. Benthic, as I already told you, benthic organisms are bottom dwellers and they are of two types: bagile, that means the mobile benthos, and the sessile, that is the permanently attached or immobile, or the benthic organisms which are attached to the substrate, and they are known as sessile benthos. Now, if we consider the biological environment of an organism, that is, now we are dealing with the biological factors, and organisms starting with the green plants, it takes various abiotic components from the nature. One important component is light, another is nutrients from the substrate, nutrients from the soil, and they produce food. They photosynthesis in the presence of sunlight, in presence of um, atmospheric carbon dioxide, in presence of nutrients, they photosynthesis and produce food and byproduct oxygen. Now those organisms which directly depends on the plants, which directly plants and their components as their food material, they are herbivores. Herbivores are taken by the carnivores. Carnivores, there are several orders: first order carnivore, second order carnivore, third order carnivore. After their death or during their lifetime, there are some organisms that depend uh, for their nutrition to other animal bodies. These are known as parasites. That means during their lifetime they are benefited by some other kinds of animals, that is, they mutually live together. These are parasites, and the death of these organisms, after their death of herbivores, carnivores, and parasites as well as plants, they are decomposed by the decomposing and scavenging organisms. Those are known as decomposers and scavengers, and they are transformed into raw materials and mixed with the substrate or mixed with the soils. Then they again take part into this cycle. So this entire supply of energy, starting from the sunlight to green plants to herbivores, carnivores, parasites, scavengers, decomposers, and again mixed with soil, there is a continuous change. So this is called food chain or food web, or this is also known as trophic structures of energy condition, trophic structures of food. Now, among this entire food chain or food web, there is one part that is living portion, dealing with all the living beings of the nature. These are the green plants, decomposer, transformers, herbivores, parasites, scavengers, carnivores. So they all are living components of nature. And there is the other part, that is the raw nutrients, sunlight, atmospheric carbon dioxide. They are the non-living component of nature. Now, whenever we try to study ecology, we have to take in consideration both the living components as well as the non-living components. The non-living components are discussed in detail in all the previous slides. Here we deal with the living components. Now, whenever an organism interact with other organisms, the interaction is done mainly for three reasons: for food, for space, and for mate. So food is used for its regular day-to-day life activity so that organisms can get energy for any kind of work. That is why organisms require food for fulfilling its energy requirement. So because of the energy requirement, organisms takes food. Next is space. After taking food or after fulfilling the energy condition of an organisms require an area or space in which they can be live in a protected way so that they cannot be harmed by their enemies. So they require a shelter. And lastly, an organism requires an mate that is of opposite sex so that they can reproduce and continue their uh, biological gene pool, that is for mate. So for these three reasons, mainly organisms interact with uh, the environment as well as with other organic bodies. This is the main three reasons. Now for these, organisms sometimes face competition among themselves, so that who can get better food, who can get better shelter, or who can get better mate. So for that, organisms are involved in competition, and sometimes they are involved in um, war also, that is known as predations. So the higher level organisms can take the lower level organisms as their food, or sometimes simply during this competition we simply killed or we simply wipe out the inferior groups, the inferior variables. That means the weakers are simply being killed by the strongers. And sometimes there are some other organisms which are known as parasites. They are attached with the host body, and sometimes the host body benefited, or sometimes the host body is not benefited, or sometimes the host body affected or may not affected. So this depends and remain attached to an other organisms and lives mutually, but the host body sometimes affected or sometimes being not affected. So by this process, what we do, we eliminate some species, some individuals from the environment so that we can live in a better way. We can get all these three things and the best we can get. And during these processes, there are some traces produced which are preserved in the fossil records also. Such examples are drill hole marks, the bite marks, and shell breakage. Sometimes organisms mechanically make an hollow within the hard part of an organisms, and those are known as drill holes. So those drill holes can be preserved in the fossil record. Sometimes some organisms like crabs, they break the shells of the mollusks, they break the shell of gastropods, so that breakage marks is remained within the hard parts. Sometimes a large reptile can completely swallow or a bite over the other organisms. So those bite marks or the teeth marks are also preserved. But if the organisms can be completely taken, completely swallowed, then there will be no record, then there will be no evidence which can be preserved in the fossil record. And in that case, the biological interaction, the evidence of biological interaction will be lost. So we did not get any kind of those kinds of informations. These are the books which you might follow for studying paleoecology in your undergrad classes.